Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. This is the third session for our Listening to Aronld Schoenberg Symposium. We have three wonderful presentations this morning. We're going to begin with Gordon Root, who is currently Associate Professor at the State University of New York at Fredonia, where he has taught since 2006. In 2016, Professor Root edited a critical edition of Schoenberg's Models for Beginners in Composition with commentary through Oxford University Press. His article, Why Models Matters, was recently published in the European Journal of Musicology, and his essay, The Idea Behind Schoenberg's Teaching, will soon be available in Schoenberg in Context, published by Cambridge University Press. Gordon's talk this morning is titled Schoenberg Plays the Blues, the Applications and Mythologies of the 12-Tone Method in Popular Culture. Please welcome Gordon Root.
Thank you. So I'm going to just adjust the mic here. A couple things here. So I should mention that in the interest of time, for some of these examples, I'm not going to play the audio. For some of them, I will. For a lot of them, I think you'll be familiar with the examples, so I'm going to skip over the audio for that. And I just realized I have the wrong glasses on. 1 second. So I won't be able to see what I'm reading. I apologize for that. While editing Models for Beginners in Composition, I often found it tricky to categorize Schoenberg's syllabus. Was it a textbook, a snapshot of his teaching, or something a bit different than either of these things? The terse, mysterious nature of MBC seems to invite such questions, and like a choose-your-own-adventure book, it can either take you on a winding journey or an express trip to beginning composition. It all depends on what you bring to it. In the commentary, I interpret MBC as central to what Sabine Feist has described as Schoenberg's courtship of American audiences during the 30s and 40s. Among the works that Feist views as seasoned to American tastes are the Suite in G for string orchestra and Theme and Variations for band, Opus 43A, the latter a work that Schoenberg had hoped would be appropriate for college bands. As I explained, there's even evidence that Schoenberg sketched portions of Opus 43A in the exercises of MBC. So although my paper today may seem to come out of the blue, I might argue that the blues came out of my edition of MBC quite naturally, by taking Schoenberg's courtship of American audiences as a point of departure and by asking the simple question, did it work? And if so, what traces of Schoenberg's musical legacy and thought do we find in the public sphere today? In exploring this legacy, I not only retrace some familiar popular references to 12-tone composition from the 50s through the 70s, but I also examined several new examples from the 21st century. Along the way, I touch on works that advance the popular mystique and mythology surrounding Schoenberg's 12-tone method. Some examples may not be so different from a short work by Warren or Babbitt, while others veer significantly from Schoenberg's 12-tone method. Although I will often highlight such distinctions, I'll also argue that authenticity is not the point here. My intent is to explore the one aspect of Schoenberg's thought that has managed to impact popular culture most profoundly. Our first stop? Children's television, of course. In his 1941 essay, Cartoon Music of the Future, MGM composer Scott Bradley argues for an equal balance of music and animation, a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk for tots. The commercial needs of a burgeoning film industry soon squelched this dream of a baby Bayreuth, but Bradley never lost his desire to write vibrant original music for cartoons. In his 1944 talk for the Music Forum, Bradley describes a much-discussed passage from Puttin' on the Dog, in which he allegedly uses a 12-tone row to mimic the image of Tom running around with the mask of a large dog on his head. After trying a conventional approach to this image, Bradley finally deemed tonality inadequate. Finally, I tried the 12-tone scale, and there it was. This scene was repeated 5 times within the next 50 seconds, and I had only to use my scale. That's the scene. If taken uncritically, this passage raises 2 problems. One, it fails to state all 12 tones. The other, the theme never moves beyond the original row. Sure, the sound of a row is important, but so is what you do with it. Yet this anecdote has become so entrenched in the popular imagination that logic may figure less than legend. For many readers of Goldmark's books, the melody in slide 3 is a row, and a statement of a row is 12-tone music. But could it be that this little gesture and a similar one from The Cat Who Hated People have thrust Schoenberg's ideas about music into the popular sphere more prominently than his own attempts? As Oscar Wilde once said, there's only one thing in the world worse than being talked about, and that is not being talked about. If this is true, then Thomas Mann's scathing critique in Dr. Faustus has kept the 12-tone method in good stead ever since its 1947 publication. According to commentator T.J. Reid, Leverkusen's fixed note series was intended as a metaphor for Nazi Germany. What Leverkusen desires is a refuge from the burden of historical freedom, where every musical gambit is known before you even write a note. In his new method, Leverkusen finds shelter from the weight of such decisions. But for Mann, this reliance on method instead of musical choice ran parallel to the Nazis' appeal to, quote, the primitive instincts of a once civilized nation. Now, equating a compositional method to a regime responsible for so much atrocity is surely apples to oranges, yet Mann may be partly responsible for the persistent characterization of 12-tone music as tyrannical. Well, he and Schoenberg, who allegedly guaranteed the supremacy of German music for the next 100 years upon inventing the 12-tone method in 1921. However, in his 2002 essay, The Most Famous Thing He Never Said, Randall Schoenberg offers compelling evidence that Schoenberg probably said something more nuanced than what Josef Rufer remembered. But alas, the original quote has stuck. And yet, when musicians in the popular sphere experiment with 12-tone composition, one gets the sense that they do so in part because it offers refuge from a different tyrant altogether. Sure, for some, it may rent cheap seats at Club Prestige, but for others, it provides genuine refuge. Not from sophistication, as Mann had imagined, but rather from the tired patterns of tonal cliches and outworn commercialism. According to acclaimed music journalist Bill Milkowski, This was the spirit with which a young Jaco Pastorius once recorded Balloon Song. When Pastorius and bandmates cut 6 songs at Criteria Studios in 1974, Balloon Song, parenthetically titled 12-Tone, eventually contributed to the posthumous album Modern American Music, Period. In his liner notes, Milkowski describes the tune as, quote, a treasure, a previously unreleased 12-tone gem. To be sure, Balloon Song features a superlative unison performance that sounds a bit like a Leisure Suit era Messiaen writing Dance of Fury for Funk Combo instead of Pierrot Ensemble. But is it a 12-tone work? Doubtful. Yet Jaco's piece clearly pays homage to the 12-tone method. So I should mention that I have Yuki Atori at the bottom of the screen here because I've lifted his transcription. That's his transcription. I've added the row numbers. So he has transcribed Pastorius's piece here. As slide 6 shows, the ensemble in Balloon Song states 15 unique row forms, followed by a climactic row 16, composed of 3 pentatonic tetrachords related by thirds. The final tetrachord in row 16, a G pentatonic subset, is the same tetrachord that begins row 1, thus completing a varied return to the opening before landing on a cadential G7 sharp 11 chord. Perhaps the metaphor of this maximalist outburst, followed by a varied recap, analogizes the idea of a balloon ascending into the sky, taking a brief journey, and descending back to earth again. As neat as Jaco's tune may be, and as apt as it is for the program, 16 unrelated rows in 25 seconds seems clearly at odds with Schoenberg's conception of unity in 12-tone music. In his famous essay, 12-Tone Composition, Schoenberg describes an effective 12-tone work as a series of developing variations in which all main themes are, quote, transformations of the first phrase. Clearly, Balloon Song falls short of this, yet YouTube is filled with creators and commentators echoing Milkowski's 12-tone claim. Still, I find Pastorius's reference to 12-tone composition in a jazz setting significant. What matters is how Schoenberg's ideas influenced a young musician to write his own take on a 12-tone piece. It's his interpretation of what 12-tone music might be, and this is, after all, how popular culture works. From this perspective, we might hear Balloon Song as a sort of translation of Schoenberg's ideas into the language and aesthetics of popular music, where you hear something you like, you learn it, and then you do it your own way. There are, in fact, many examples of jazz musicians experimenting with 12-tone composition in this way. Perhaps the earliest one is Leonard Feather's 1959 number, 12-Tone Blues. As Feather explains, it was after reading H.H. Stuckenschmidt's biography on Schoenberg that he was inspired to combine, quote, the form of the blues with the seemingly incompatible essence of the dodecaphonic technique. In a 1966 article for Downbeat magazine, Feather shows how his row transpositions relate to the blues progression, a feature that allows him to pair a 12-tone melody with a blues bass. Yusef Lateef's performance on Live at Pep's Lounge, 1964, is probably the most iconic version of 12-tone blues, and the one that no doubt inspired others to write similar heads, including Bill Evans, who wrote 12-tone 2, tune on the Bill Evans album, 1971, and 12-tone tune 2 for the live album, the Tokyo Concert, 1973. Of course, Frank Zappa experimented with 12-tone composition in a few works, including Waltz for Guitar, 1958. Sabina Feist mentioned several 20th century composers such as Gunther Schuller, Earl Brown, and Hale Smith, who combined jazz, classical, and 12-tone writing in their works. More recent examples of studies dealing with blends of jazz and 12-tone music include John O'Gallagher's 2021 study, 12-Tone Improvisation, and Bruce Aronld's 2003 self-monograph, My Music. Aronld's album, Give 'Em Some, combines elements of King Crimson with 80s rock and serial resources. The album opens with a Fripp-like nod to Schoenberg titled Blues for Arnie. As slide 9 illustrates, Blues for Arnie has two main sections, each based on the same 013 derived row. Section A features the trichords in their original order as A, B, C, D, while Section B scrambles this ordering so that it becomes B, D, A, C. Even YouTuber Rick Beato has recently hopped aboard the 12-tone train, dedicating an episode of What Makes This Song Great to that nagging question that haunts all of us late at night when we're driving on dark, desolate highways. How do we properly incorporate 12-tone rows into our rock solos?
Hi everybody, I'm Rick Beato. In this episode of Everything Music, we're going to talk about 12-tone triads. Okay, this is a concept that I came up with about 30 years ago.
In a more substantive way, big band composer Erica Seguin has taught young musicians how to apply 12-tone music to popular genres. According to Seguin, it was the emotive power and expressive pliability of 12-tone music that made it a good fit for her 2014 work, And the Tire Swing Keeps Spinning. The piece opens with 3 slow-moving statements of P7 in the piano, accompanied by pitches belonging to the prevailing tetrachord of the moment, though not necessarily in contiguous order. To cut it off actually, but notice the hexatonic structure of Seguin's row, which allows for an eerie G minor hexachord followed by F minor. This results in a sort of blurred tonality, one reminiscent of tradition but without the functional baggage. In fact, I would argue that uncanny tonality of some sort is sought by most popular artists who experiment with 12-tone music. In the realm of non-professionals, A quick search yields hundreds of YouTubers with a substantial collection of 12-tone metal and rock tunes for your listening pleasure. Not that I recommend sliding all the way down this rabbit hole, but that it can be slid down at all underscores the mystique that 12-tone composition can hold for musicians in the popular arena. Sabine Feist mentioned several film scores that feature serial techniques, including Hans Eisler's Reagan, 1929, and Ice, 1943, and David Raksin's Laura, 1944, and Force of Evil, 1948. In addition to these, Jerry Goldsmith's 1968 music for Planet of the Apes is probably the most iconic example. In his 2019 dissertation, The Forbidden Zone, Escaping Earth and Tonality, Vincent Gassi explores the serial and programmatic aspects of Goldsmith's music. According to Gassi, traditional film scores tend to rely on tonal cliches, a situation that often results in the incongruous pairing of inventive imagery with conventional musical patterning. In contrast, Goldsmith has created his musical material from scratch, which results in fewer preconceived metaphorical relationships. Thus, Goldsmith is able to tailor a unique expressive language to fit the novel imagery of his subject. Finally, I turn to David Shire's compelling score for the 1974 thriller, The Taking of Pelham, 1, 2, 3, about 4 hijackers who take over New York's Pelham Bay Park train, holding its passengers hostage and demanding a whopping $1 million ransom. Like Feather's 12-tone blues, The Taking of Pelham combines 12-tone and tonalesque elements. The music for the main title is a funk tour de force, led by a B-flat minor bass ostinato, B-flat, D-flat, above which trumpets state P9 of the row as a series of call and response trichords. The effect of the main title is a tonal versus non-tonal cacophony. The quasi-tonal layer evokes the atmosphere of a gritty metropolis. However, the way in which Shire's dissonant row clashes against the foundation foreshadows a sinister intrusion into this urban fabric. This, I argue, is the central metaphor of Shire's oil and water juxtaposition of tonalesque ostinato against 12-tone elements in the film. The scene of the hijacking divides into 2 parts. First, the hijackers take the train. Second, they prepare to get the train moving again. As slide 14 shows, Shire composes a simple binary form to fit the scene. Part 1 arpeggiates the trichords of the row as a succession of sustained chords. Part 2 mimics the attempt to get the train moving through several rhythmically active row statements. Beneath the 12-tone structure, an ostinato bass vamps on a woozy minor ninth. A militaristic snare completes the effect of an off-kilter bolero, or maybe a demented military march. It's a compliment to Shire's skill as a composer that critics have often praised this hard-grooving score with no reference to the 12-tone structure that hums silently under its hood. Earlier, I described Schoenberg's courtship of American audiences during the 30s and 40s. In this narrative, Schoenberg's tonal works are often portrayed as his American greeting card, while his 12-tone works are seen as cerebral and academic. For a legion of theorists whose bread and butter lay in decoding these works, such complexity was seldom a bad thing. Yet, in these analyses, some writers have sensed the equation of technical complexity with aesthetic valuation. In The Poetic Fallacy, Richard Taruskin asks of Schoenberg, "Can this man or his music be successfully popularized?" Admittedly, I have not addressed this question because I have not so much discussed Schoenberg's own music as I have its influence on a certain segment of popular music. However, I would argue that many of Schoenberg's ideas on music have been popularized, at least to the degree that we welcome many other genres into this swirling melange that we call popular music. Ironically, it was never Schoenberg's conscious attempts at outreach that were destined to hit the mark. Instead, it was his less accommodating 12-tone method that would end up making landfall in the popular arena. So, is Webern's proverbial postman whistling 12-tone themes while making his rounds in 2024? Maybe not. But I'll bet some of you will be whistling Taking Pelham 1, 2, 3 while you make your rounds to get coffee after this session ends. And that's more than I can say for lots of other film scores. Thank you. Oh.
There we go. Thank you so much, Gordon. Wonderful presentation.
I forgot to move it forward, too. Well, not that.
Any comments and questions for Gordon? Thank you. That was wonderful.
Yeah, thanks for the great paper. I was interested, you talked about this rabbit hole of all this 12-tone inspired rock stuff on YouTube.
Yeah.
And that's amazing, but is there a clear, ideological signaling that people are doing by saying this is a 12-tone piece? Are they meaning it to say this is somehow important, or this is high culture, or this is, transgressive, or this is what are the range of messages that people seem to be communicating by making this gesture?
That's a great question. I did see a range of kind of ideas there. One thing that I noticed, some of them would start with a presentation like I might give in my theory class or something. In 1921, Schoenberg invented the 12-tone method with a slideshow and Schoenberg, and then they would come up, but then they would chicka 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 chicka. It was really interesting. It was like a presentation on 12-tone music and then their piece, and then others would just have their piece. Just they're sitting there with their guitar, and this is usually it was some kind of slideshow sort of thing. So they would be showing they felt that it was necessary to show how the piece worked, I think, usually. Yeah,
I mean, you don't have to become an ethnomusicologist, but this is a great example of where some ethnographic work could be really good, and just because it would, I think, illustrate your point in various ways to say what's at stake for you. Because I've been corresponding with this noise musician who was active since the 80s, and it's very intense. It's the most intense transgressive stuff you can imagine, and he seems interested in Schoenberg for just the kind of the power and the noise and the sound and the dissonance, and that's kind of how he's constructing a Schoenberg that gives him kind of a starting point and a support.
Yeah.
But then there's all this kind of intense metal music that is really virtuosic, like this band Meshuggah, where it's like this intense virtuosity and brain stuff. And I think, there's a part of that scene where it's all about kind of virtuosity and intellectual energy and complexity. And I can imagine them thinking, that's what they're getting from Schoenberg. But all these people are imagining their own Schoenberg, so that'd be very cool to unpack.
I did come across some bands that were like that. That seemed to be serial-based metal bands, but I could have gotten into that probably a little bit more, but I didn't explore it very much. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Great paper, and I have thought about this topic for a long time.
Yeah,
And I just want to add to Joe, and what I think comes through a lot is that these musicians are fascinated with Schoenberg's musical outsider status, and kind of the rebellious nature, even though Schoenberg never wanted to be a revolutionary, but of course he stylized himself as an outsider, musical outsider, and he was defined as such by many other musicians. And so I think that has a lot of appeal for musicians who want to stick out and do something different and really kind of surprise audiences. So that's one comment, and then I have a few other comments. And for instance, so you, at the beginning of your paper, you talk about Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus. And the interesting thing about that novel is that it's talked about a lot. It had a lot of controversies, but who has actually read this thing? And I did too, but it took me like 5 attempts. I took a class on this novel and didn't actually read it all the way through while taking the class. And so it's so interesting that, this is taken as, an example of how the Schoenberg, Schoenberg's 12-tone technique would become mythologized and so forth, when most people wouldn't actually do the hard work and read through the novel. And so I'm skeptical about that. And so then I have 2 other comments. So actually, David Raksin's score for Laura doesn't have any 12-tone. I don't know how, that's not in my book. But Force of Evil is more dissonant than Laura is a very tonal score. But Eisler's Hangman Also Die has 12-tone.
I thought I read that in the film article, but I'll correct that.
Definitely not. And then Erika Seguin, she also did a Happy Birthday version in 12-tone. Have you come across that one?
No, I didn't see that.
There are a whole bunch of... I actually, when I gave a talk on Schoenberg's birthday in Los Angeles, and I thought for a moment, could I end my talk with a 12-tone version of Happy Birthday? But I didn't do it.
Yeah.
It would have, in any case, but I came up with unbelievable stuff on the internet.
Just logically thinking about Laura, the movie, all I can hear is the tune Laura going through the whole movie, so that makes perfect sense. It's just the tune Laura the whole time.
Right.
I should have thought of that.
Dramatic film score, but very romantic.
Yeah, it's just the tune Laura the whole time.
So, Sabina, Happy Birthday is a sentence structure. So you could very easily create a 12-tone row with the basic idea, right?
I wanted to say one thing about Schoenberg as the outsider. This paper was not about 12-tone music originally. It was just about all the ways I could think of that Schoenberg had possibly influenced popular culture. And I thought I was reading a John Cale biography, and John Cale was talking about listening to Schoenberg on the radio in England. And John Cale went on to play bass for the Velvet Underground and co-write a bunch of the songs on the first couple of Velvet Underground albums. And I was just thinking about that the Velvet Underground went on to influence all kinds of bands, Can, Wire, Kraftwerk, Joy Division, all these kind of not indie rock like we think of now, but indie rock like it used to be. And I was thinking, well, what is it that he got from Schoenberg? They weren't influenced in the least bit by Schoenberg's music. What it was his outsider status, the idea that he was unafraid to strike out on his own, and I think that was it. So I really like that, what you said.
And I want to just make one more comment, the way you could approach this whole phenomenon, whether you have just vague references to the 12-tone technique, incomplete rows, or statements of the row without any row transformations. You can approach it with the term thick description of the 12-tone technique. All the references, different types of references to 12-tone music, and then shedding light on Schoenberg's significance in a much broader sense and on a broader scale. And in the end, maybe it doesn't matter so much that it's just a row might be thrown in, but that in itself is already like a statement about Schoenberg. And
yes,
so
that's what I was trying to say. But I also wanted to point out that it wasn't a row. But I think that's what's more important, what you're saying.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, really great paper, Gordon. Really interesting material there. I was wondering, and like in particular, thinking about, there are like especially these YouTubers and sort of non-professional practitioners of their versions of 12-tone music. If they're signaling some sort of outsider status, then that's in some ways like very different from the way that 12-tone music is approached in academia, where like there's the phase of like 12-tone tyranny and all of the responses that you get to that in the academy. And so I was wondering, and this may or may not be something that you've seen in their videos. I have not gone down this rabbit hole yet, but after your paper maybe I will. Do you have a sense of where their information on 12-tone music, incomplete and scattered as it sometimes is actually coming from? Like, were these music majors who had like one class in post-tonal theory and that's what they remember, or was it from books of another sort? It probably wasn't from analysis of Schoenberg's music. It probably wasn't from Dr. Faustus. Yeah. But that might like give information on like their purposes for engaging that idea, if it's a learned style or an outsider status.
I had wondered that too. I thought of, well, maybe they're music students, but then I thought, they could be. This is all over the internet too, and maybe they had gotten at the same place I had gotten theirs.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know. That's a good question, though. That's a good question.
So, this is one more example for your list, if you don't have this already. But a couple years ago, a recently graduated advisee of mine, his name is Michael Dakovich, called my attention to Ron Jarzambek, who was the guitarist for Blotted Science. And he has a number of YouTube videos out where he explains, basically it's a very faithful 12-tone technique. He sticks with the row and he partitions it different ways to create, leitmotivic partitions to represent, one thing or another. He did a sort of a rescoring of the insect, the Cretaceous chasm scene from King Kong, the Jack Black version of King Kong. And for each of the insects, he had a different partition that was represented. And I was amazed by it because I thought, well, this is the same thing Schoenberg does in Moses und Aaron. I mean, exactly. So Ron Jarzambek, that...
Thank you. I appreciate that.
All right, Severine has a question.
I just wanted to say, and I loved your paper. I thought it was great. There's this group. I'm trying to make this a long story short. when I was doing the Norton score, I had a copyist from Hollywood Studios, and he said to me, "Well, you have to listen to the Elvis Schoenberg Orchestra." Because I'm playing with this group, and the Elvis Schoenberg Orchestra still is in LA, and a lot of the studio musicians, like the fellow who was talking to me, he went, to community college. He learned something about 12-tone music, but then he said that this guy who runs, he's got a lot of money, and he runs the Elvis Schoenberg Orchestra. And I listened to some of this stuff. It's like you start hearing, it's all clips, like these boots are made for walking, and then all of a sudden you'd hear a Bartung come in. Wow. But the studio musicians are really terrific musicians with terrific ears. And so I don't know, you could, I can give you, the guy's name, you want to call him up, who knows about this kind of thing and worked in that. And it is an orchestra, too. And they do play from scores, so I don't know. I'm adding my 2 cents.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Anyway,
that's really cool.
Thanks for the great
thank
paper.
you. Thank you.
Okay. Another comment?
Yeah.
It's just a quick comment, but also, like, let's say next time you go down that rabbit hole, you have a little reading list of the OUP Schoenberg Writings editions that you just paste in, so every one of these people sees that because they would be interested, and maybe give a free PDF available. Like, why not actually take this opportunity to reach this population in a different way? I know you don't think that's your job, but it's not my job either, but it's somebody's job. So people in charge of this edition need to just, because, there is an audience out there eager to learn.
That's true, yeah. That's true.
One more question for me.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Did you go down a rabbit hole of musical theater? So I'm thinking West Side Story. There's a statement of a 12-tone row in there.
Yeah. Yeah, right, yeah. No, I didn't really, no. No.
Yeah, just curious.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's good, though.
Bernstein also wrote music for a musical about, there was a Francis Ford Coppola film called Tucker about a guy who developed a car that was so much safer than all the rest of the cars. That actually started, Coppola wanted that to be a musical, and Bernstein and Comden and Green were going to write the musical, and Schoenberg, in the Library of Congress, there's in his sketches for that, he called it the wheel row, and it's kind of a derived row, so it has this repetitious quality. And then he wrote 2 songs based on the wheel row. So, yeah.
What? I'll have to ask you about that a little bit.
All right. Thank you so.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Gordon. Yeah.
Oh, thank you,
I got so
you,
excited
everybody.
there.
I really learned a lot too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank Gordon again, please.
Thank you.
Well, we're going back to the old days, folks. Going back to not the old country, but nevertheless, that's the case. My paper today has 3 parts. The first talks a little bit about Schoenberg's pedagogical writings in a very general sense.
I don't think I need to give an introduction.
Yeah. I think that's good. Okay. You don't have to read the whole bio. I think that's fine. Anyway, the first part of the paper, deals with his kind of philosophical notions of teaching. Then I move into one of the books in my edition, the preliminary exercises in Counterpoint, or should I say, I'll use Schoenberg's title, be official, Preliminary Exercises, Volume 1 of Counterpoint. He had 3 volumes in mind. And then the third part is the posthumous publishing of preliminary exercises that Leonard Stein pursued in the familiar book to us, Preliminary Exercises in Counterpoint. And the situation and the people at Faber who brought that into reality, or made it a reality. Okay, so I will begin. Is there any, and you're going to switch, what's happening?
If you want me to, I can.
Yeah, you better, because I don't know, machines don't like me. Okay. Okay. Good? All right. And I shall watch here. Okay. Arnold Schoenberg is not only an iconic composer, but also was one of the foremost teachers of European music in the first half of the 20th century. His students include the composers Alban Berg, Anton Webern, John Cage, Lou Harrison, and Elsa Bienenfeld, the first woman to receive a doctorate in musicology at the University of Vienna. Another student, Professor Patricia Carpenter, was founder of the doctoral program in music theory at Columbia University. This lecture comes out of work with her. She also taught Philip Murray Deneen, Professor Emeritus of Music Theory at the University of Ottawa. He, in turn, taught Schoenberg's theories to his then graduate student, Philip Stoker. Okay. Contemplating his teaching career near the end of his life, Schoenberg asserted, quote, "I never make a point that is not composition." Schoenberg understood the integrated study of the traditional subdisciplines of harmony, counterpoint, and form as the earliest, or in his word, embryonic stage of compositional study. He believed that his teachings would lead to a comprehensive command of tonal music, creating musicians capable of contributing original musical ideas to their art, whether as composers, performers, or scholars. In the summer of 1932, sensing that his flight from Nazified Berlin was imminent, Arnold Schoenberg began the monumental task of collecting and categorizing not only his compositional manuscripts, but also thousands of pages of teachings and writings. Those on Counterpoint, in size, range from a single aphorism to 4 larger attempts at writing a major book on the subject. After his immigration to the United States, Schoenberg worked on his 5th and largest such project from 1942 to 44 and from 48 to 50 in Los Angeles. You are looking at the first page of the second draft of Preliminary Exercises, Volume 1 of Counterpoint, which in 1963 Faber and Faber would publish as Preliminary Exercises in Counterpoint, edited by Schoenberg's student Leonard Stein. For many years, I have been engaged in editing Schoenberg's complete set of surviving writings on Counterpoint, including a revised version of this book, and I shall now discuss some of the discoveries that have emerged from my studies. To my knowledge, Preliminary Exercises is unique from other European and American texts on Counterpoint in that it alternates the time-honored studies of species counterpoint with so-called compositional applications, focusing on subjects requiring completely original work from students. For example, in the 8th compositional application, examples proceed from the same 2 opening bars. Schoenberg required students to determine different continuations. Thus, the initial 2 measures act as a compositional source, or in his words, basic configuration or Grundgestalt. He termed the phrases moving from the tonic to another key, or in his words, region, and back to the tonic, little sentences. In each of these little sentences, Schoenberg uses distinct modulations and differing motives derived from the basic combination to give them a unique expression despite their continuation from identical measures. For instance, in the first example, moving through the median region, Schoenberg chooses the rhythmic motive of 2/8 and a quarter note with ascending and descending thirds to be developed throughout the phrase. And let's hear what Schoenberg wrote for his students. In the fourth example, proceeding through the dominant, he deals with successive half notes, often highlighting perfect fourths at registral high points. And you can see from my dots, from the red ones and the blue ones, they highlight the motives. Within preliminary exercises, such variation of the same materials occurs not only between successive examples, but through those in different chapters of the book. For instance, the lines in the non-modulatory contrapuntal combination of Part 1, Chapter 7, that's the one in the upper left-hand corner on the slide, and it's marked with a star and a square, morphs into a modulatory form in Part 1, Chapter 8, and that's below it. It also acquires different added voices in Part 2, Chapter 6, and that's pictured on the right. That's the bigger example. Thus, Schoenberg extended the ways of varying the same materials beyond single small examples and into more sophisticated situations, all essential for the future composition of a coherent piece. And we can just listen to the basic combination itself and then the longer version with the added voice. Hence, when summarizing Schoenberg's pedagogy in Counterpoint, his student Anton Webern wrote, "Above all, Schoenberg demands that the pupil not write any old notes, showing that he wants just to fill out an academic form, but rather executes these works as a result of a need for expression. Therefore, the pupil actually creates something, even at the most primitive stages of constructing musical passages. What Schoenberg then explains to the pupil results organically from the work. He brings no external dogma to it. What Schoenberg truly teaches is part of the creative process." And now I'll turn to the editing, the initial editing of preliminary exercises. Between November 1942 in March 1943, Schoenberg, a native German speaker, wrote a first version of preliminary exercises in English on his own. And you're looking at the first page of it. However, because he questioned his command of the English language, Schoenberg sought assistance from his former student, the pianist Leonard Stein, who had recently helped him with the musical examples and text of models for beginners in composition, which of course Gordon edited for our series. Schoenberg felt that Stein, although he knew no German, had an uncanny ability to transform his Teutonic constructions and incorrect word choices into an English text that still could preserve the tone of his voice. He was concerned with the sound and his own personality. Schoenberg and Stein worked continually on this second draft of preliminary exercises from April 1943 until March 1944, when the composer developed serious problems with eyesight and with diabetes. Yet Schoenberg remained deeply committed to finishing not only certain of his compositions like Moses und Aaron and Die Jakobsleiter, but also the theoretical pedagogical works. He succinctly described his feelings in a letter to his close friends who lived in Jerusalem. Dr. Childs Wolfson was, he even wrote a canon for him. He was a doctor in Berlin who also was a wonderful pianist. And his wife was the mother of Peter Grodenwitz from her first marriage, so that very close. And what he wrote to them was, "I must try to live as long as necessary. Let us hope." During this crisis of health, Schoenberg decided to halt work on the Counterpoint project and return to the more completed book on form entitled Fundamentals of Musical Composition, of course, which Phil talked about yesterday. However, his attempts at publishing this text in 1946 were unsuccessful. With Stein's help, Schoenberg then began the book project Structural Functions of Harmony, which was initially part of Fundamentals of Musical Composition. In 1948, when Stein was preparing the final text of Structural Functions, Schoenberg returned to preliminary exercises, working with his former graduate student, Patricia Carpenter, who would prepare transcriptions of the text by listening to statements Schoenberg made on a Webster Chicago wire recorder. This machine, a gift from his former student, Clara Silvers, helped Schoenberg deal more easily with his poor eyesight, which had become more severe. And this is his thank you note made on the wire recorder to Clara Silvers, who eventually married Steuermann, the pianist.
Dear Miss Silvers, after this attempt, I will try now for the perhaps 6th or 7th time to speak to you. I want to thank you very cordially for this wonderful gift. The Webster wire recorder. I am sure it will help me to really finish this book on Counterpoint, at least first volume. Preliminary exercises in time. After all, I will have at first to acquire to know exactly what I want to say before I start. Because this is what always happens. And why I ruined half a spool already, throwing away the wire. But this time I hope it will succeed. I will succeed better. I am sure that when I can finish this book, there will be a possibility to reward you, making it known to everybody who reads this book that I thank it to you that I could do this in my present state. Thank you very much, Miss Clara Silvers.
After Patricia Carpenter had completed her transcriptions of Schoenberg's dictation on the wire recorder, Leonard Stein returned to work directly with Schoenberg on the rough drafts of parts 2 and 3 of preliminary exercises. However, Schoenberg's health was poor, and the editorial work between himself and Stein progressed slowly. On the 20th of December, 1948, Stein and Schoenberg signed an agreement witnessed by the composer's secretary, editor, and cousin, the composer Richard Hoffman, stating that if their work on preliminary exercises and structural functions of harmony was not completed during the composer's lifetime, Stein would prepare the final versions of both books for publication. Once the texts were completed, the composer's wife, Gertrude Schoenberg, would handle all legal and business matters dealing with their publication. After signing the contract, Schoenberg and Stein worked intermittently on preliminary exercises until July 1950, at which point Schoenberg wrote in a letter to the conductor Hermann Scherchen, "The theory of form is not finished, neither is the counterpoint. I would be glad to complete both, but what more can I do?" He died a year later on the 13th of July, 1951. I'd now like to go into the posthumous publishing of preliminary exercises. In 1954, you can see 4 years later, soon after assisting the British composer-musicologist Humphrey Searle with the addition of structural functions of harmony, Stein began his transformation of the draft of preliminary exercises into a published book, thus fulfilling his agreement with Schoenberg. With Gertrude Stein's permission, Stein first studied source materials in the composer's estate. The ensuing photo, the one you're looking at, was taken in the same year that she was working with Stein, and it shows Gertrude Schoenberg on the 12th March 1954 at the premiere of Schoenberg's opera Moses und Aaron. She appears with her daughter Nuria and the conductor of the performance, Hans Rosbud. I just want to parenthetically tell you that Nuria told me she thought on that night she met a significant person, the composer Luigi Nono. And so that her future husband and, of course, Gertrude's son-in-law. Okay. When looking through Schoenberg's estate to collect the extant manuscripts, Stein was elated to find his teacher's outlines for preliminary exercises, Volume 1 of Counterpoint, and its companion text, Contrapuntal Composition, Volume 2 of Counterpoint, and a small black notebook labeled Essays. Schoenberg's outline Stein's outline, pictured here, copied Schoenberg's. It was especially helpful to Stein when writing his own texts for the final chapters of Part 3, for which Schoenberg had only completed musical examples. He had written all 642 musical examples for preliminary exercises, some quite lengthy, before writing the text. And if you want to see some of you're looking at one of his large examples. There's 90 of those. And if you can, yeah. This is my transcription. You can see it's been very busy with many examples. And of course, it has clef conversion so that people will have more facility in reading the book. But by writing all these examples before putting anything in words, one might say the preliminary exercises in his other books, he did the same thing, was in some sense a musical composition, which was then put into prose. By the 24th of September 1957, Stein had prepared a first draft to be sent to the publisher Faber & Faber Limited in London, a firm which in the 1930s had been under the directorship of the Nobel Prize-winning poet, essayist, and playwright T.S. Eliot. And you can see him with his family, and Richard de la Mare, he has the arrow behind him, son of the poet Walter de la Mare. Under their leadership, Faber and Faber had helped rescue Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. They saved the young German Jewish type designer, Bernhold Volpe, by hiring him at their firm. When initially escaping to London, Volpe worked with Stanley Morrison, who was then creating Times New Roman, which I think all of us are familiar with. Volpe then designed his own font, Albertus. Here we see it in the cover of Stein's Preliminary Exercises in Counterpoint. I'll parenthetically say you can see the whole Bloomsbury Circle and T.S. Eliot, and they're all books designed with this font and by this man. Volpe was also known for designs referring to books' contents, and he hyphenated Counterpoint, suggesting a two-part species exercise. I always thought it was odd to see that hyphenated word. I said, why didn't they put Counterpoint together? But that was the principle of it. Okay. On the 14th of December, 1957, Peter du Sautoy, the vice chairman of Faber and Faber Limited, confirmed to Gertrude Schoenberg that he had received the text of preliminary exercises from Stein. Stein used Schoenberg's 1944 title for the text, Preliminary Exercises on Counterpoint. Over the next year, du Sautoy and the musicologist Donald Mitchell, the managing editor at Faber and a founder of the publishing house, discussed how to pay the cost of printing the book's hundreds of examples, while Stein made additional edits involving the book's physical presentation. Once the editorial board at Faber approved the book, a contract for its publication would be signed by Gertrude Schoenberg with mention of Stein's involvement. 2 years later, in mid-September 1961, du Sautoy received Stein's final version of the manuscript, which unfortunately is not extant. Although the editorial board was impressed by the text, du Sautoy had asked his newly hired young colleague, the 27-year-old Gilles de la Mare, to further edit Stein's manuscript. The grandson of the British poet, Walter de la Mare, and the son of Richard de la Mare, then the president of Faber, Gilles was raised in a home in which he heard, read, and himself wrote the most eloquent, erudite, and expressive forms of British English. When he read Stein's manuscript, the well-meaning Gilles de la Mare informed du Sautoy that he believed that its English was unacceptable and that he, although only an amateur musician, could edit it thoroughly. When Stein learned of Gilles de la Mare's plans for the edition, he became concerned that the young editor would tamper with Schoenberg's musical ideas. He wrote to Gertrude Schoenberg that de la Mare seemed to be, quote, a very conscientious chap, but a little overzealous, unquote. Since Stein would soon be offering piano recitals in London under the auspices of the BBC, he wisely suggested to de la Mare that he discuss preliminary exercises in person. De la Mare agreed at once, and several months later, Stein wrote to Gertrude Schoenberg from London, quote, I hope you will forgive this brief letter, but I am in the midst of cleaning up on the Counterpoint book, which consists of checking every suggestion for change made by, we call Gilles, the nickname he gave to Gilles de la Mare, the editor's editor. The day after writing to Gertrude Schoenberg, Stein and de la Mare completed their work, including changing Stein's original title, Preliminary Exercise on Counterpoint, the one that Schoenberg himself used, to Preliminary Exercises in Counterpoint. One can speculate that the new title, probably the suggestion of Gilles de la Mare, was meant to be an abbreviated version of Schoenberg's very first name for the book, Preliminary Exercises, Volume 1 of Counterpoint. So it's, conflating that idea. Du Sautoy then wrote to Mrs. Schoenberg, assuring her that the project would come to fruition. Delayed by the preparation of the 642 examples, preliminary exercises eventually appeared in print on 27th of June, 1963, 2 years after the final meeting of Stein and de la Mare. I have one other comment, and then I'm going to end my paper. This is the last section. The informal publication agreement between Schoenberg and Leonard Stein stated, quote, Mr. Stein accepts the duty to do all the work necessary for the publication, in especially improving grammar and style, and if necessary, provide good copies for text as well as music, and proofread the book until it is acceptable for publication. In the editor's foreword of preliminary exercises in Counterpoint, Leonard Stein acknowledged ways in which he changed Schoenberg's text, adding illustrations of the treatment of suspensions in three voices, omitting the discussion of modal form in a chapter on modulation, and so on. He also desired to improve the tone of Schoenberg's term little sentence and altered it to short sentence. However, certain other unacknowledged additions to the text are odd for a musician of the caliber of Leonard Stein. For example, in speaking about dissonances in third species, in his manuscript, Schoenberg writes, quote, the passing tone may occasionally change its metrical position provided it is surrounded by consonances and is at the middle note in the interval of a third. The consonances may thus be placed on weak beats, 2 and 4, and dissonances on strong beats, 1 and 3. And it should be mentioned, however, that the ancient theorists forbade the passing dissonance at the first beat. In preliminary exercises in Counterpoint, the final sentence reads, it should be mentioned, however, that theorists of traditional counterpoint forbade the passing dissonance on the first beat, as in B, and it will generally be avoided in our exercises as well. Schoenberg, in fact, never had written that the passing dissonance on the first beat would be, quote, generally avoided in our exercises, unquote, as well. In fact, such avoidance does not exist. It appears in examples in third and fifth species and the very guidelines for the use of the cambiata, with which he was obsessed and added many dissonances, not just the usual possible 2 or 1. Moreover, when Schoenberg referred to ancient theorists, he was inevitably thinking of early modal counterpoint of Johann Joseph Fuchs and his circle. Traditional theorists could occur in any century. A devoted and knowledgeable student like Stein never made these changes, but the well-meaning Gilles de la Mare could have added them. One can speculate that during their work together in London, the weary Stein, preoccupied with preliminary exercises and multiple concerts for the BBC as well, had failed to notice these omissions and additions. Moreover, Faber had quickly pushed the manuscript into production. A new edition of preliminary exercises will appear in my book for the Schoenberg in Words project for Oxford University Press. It will include sentences directly appearing in Schoenberg's final draft. This results in a different book, presenting something far closer to what Schoenberg might have wished to present. As a result, the book becomes far more original and provocative, which is what one might expect from a composer like Schoenberg, who so profoundly revolutionized Western art music, even as he retained his reverence for that same tradition. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful talk. Any questions, comments for Severine?
Well, just a little note that I really enjoyed this presentation very much. Fantastic. And I also think it's going to be amazing that all the examples will be recorded. You talked about it a lot, and it's like, wow, this is...
I'm just going to interject that these large examples, there's 93 of them, and what he was driving at was that he wanted students to be able to internalize your traditional sounds, your traditional voice leading. But he felt the only way you could do it was to, not write one little kind of, like if he gave you a cantus, that, write a couple of settings and that's it. You had to figure out at least 20. More of it, there's the famous story where Cage, he said to Schoenberg, or he came to class, and Schoenberg had looked at what he'd done, and he said, "I've done all of them." And of course, everybody believed Cage because he was very smart. And then Schoenberg kept saying, "I want another. Why don't you just give me another? Why don't you just give me another?" And Cage felt he was driving at something, and he thought about it for his whole life. And then when he got into his late life, more he was in his 70s, he said, "Well, the answer is the question. What can you go forward with more that isn't an ending circle?" And these things that, getting back to Sabina's point with the MIDI, these big examples, with the cantist in the middle, and he wrote them to show that he obviously did this, but he wanted the students to play them. And so, of course, they can print them now. All of this will be on the website. But he wanted them to also, with the repetition, they have all of them have errors. They're not perfect examples. And his method of teaching was that the students should play them and listen to them or have someone play them, and then they should point out the errors in the voice leading of traditional standards. But he also said that they would hear other sounds, and if they were composers, or for that matter, performers who have to play different things that aren't within the canonic structures of tonality, that they could use those. And he felt that this internalization, and the internalization of all of this, of course, drove Cage crazy. He left. But that this would produce people who really could listen, and there's a great emphasis now on listening, in studies of listening, and this was Schoenberg's way to get at it. And he doesn't give a list of what the errors are, but, it's an interesting thing. And I was afraid that, people now don't play. So we did, I asked my husband, who's a composer, I asked, his copyist to make the MIDI files from the finale. And so he did them, and there's hundreds. And, it's valuable if you want it's also practical with classes if you want them to actually hear and go through this method of that Schoenberg believed in, the intuitive inner self, so to speak. Yeah.
Yes, Severine, that was really an amazing paper, and so great to see it, and also how you brought all these people in and what their roles were, and like the font, the Volpe font is so beautiful and everything.
They don't use it now. I'll show you. Can I just say something,
Sure.
Kara? I looked for the modern edition of the Volpe font, and the Beach Boys. First album, the Safari. What is it? Something Safari. What is it? Surfing Safari has the it was one of the last ones to have the Albertist font in it.
So you talk about, everybody in this room knows much more than I do just about Schoenberg's style in English, which was really interesting. And you say that Leonard sort of understood how to edit it but preserve the language in a way. But one of the things at the table last night, we were talking about just like Schoenberg's love of paradox, and that like he actually was always doing word games, I think, all the time. Like everything he wrote was some sort of game and a problem and a paradox. And so I think you said this, but how much are you undoing Leonard Stein's edits or showing what the original language was, even if it's quite flawed, because sometimes he's trying to do things intentionally wrong?
Yeah, I'm not using Leonard's book.
Okay.
I'm using
all the original
the
language.
originals. But I have a different take on that we're living in a global world. And, having gone to China quite a lot and Korea, that I said, well, having Schoenberg's English with, German or word order, I mean, something like this, this is useless, frankly, because if you want to get the concept. So in the edition, in square brackets, I put what there's obviously, it's, my voice that something that is the correct English, just grammatically, and something that somebody can understand clearly. Also, somebody who's foreign, which is very important because we're not just sitting, with one each other. As far as what Stein changed, well, he listed certain of the things. I didn't like that he didn't like that thing with the little sentences and the. I traced that thing and he didn't acknowledge it, and I feel that probably the original with my brackets is better. However, and then I put the real horrible English in the footnotes. As far as but it does have Schoenberg's voice. There's certain words and kind of the flow of the text, the word order that you can still hear Austria in it.
Yeah, I want to say that on the other hand, Leonard Stein's edition of Style and Idea, he went along with polishing Schoenberg's English in massive ways that it's so far removed from Schoenberg's voice. Leo Black's using Leo Black's translation, but Leonard Stein didn't really speak German, and the one who really could negotiate this situation best was, of course, Dika Newlin, because she was fluent in German, and we know a lot about her fights with Schoenberg, dealing with his puns, his weird puns. They are even a bit strange in German sometimes, let alone translating them into English. And so, yeah, that's it's a tricky business to handle, language in the way you have it for preliminary exercises.
Yeah, well, as I said, I could only do the brackets. Also, I have the earlier manuscripts, on them, and those, of course, had to be done. And Grant Shorley translated them there, and you'll look at them soon. But I think that at least with the English, the voice will be preserved. The translations, that gets very difficult.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm also very much interested in problems of translation, and I noticed that several people use the term original, somehow a return to something original. It occurs to me that that's really problematic, right? That you have, Delamere sort of reinterpreting Stein, who's reinterpreting Schoenberg, who's reinterpreting the English Schoenberg, who's reinterpreting the German, right? And so where is the original, right? And I wonder if it really doesn't exist, because it's in this kind of interstitial space between the German and the English that produces then these kind of paradoxical phrases. And so that my sort of intuitive doubt that there is something that can be called original brings me to this question. What are you hoping to recover in this new sort of reading? Because I think everything is a reading. I think even Schoenberg is reading himself. What is it that you are hoping to recover in this new edition?
I think first that, well, I mentioned the listening to those examples. I'll take the musical before I get to the verbal, because you'll teach me on that. But I think that the examples and playing through the book, because that's the way he wrote it, it's a different way, and it starts getting around your point. If the verbal can't, we can't completely get what we want from it, whether we're an English speaker or a German speaker or something in between, we're always, futzing around with it. And I will answer what I think the original thing is. But part of the original thing, and this is part of the answer, is if you play through all the examples, and you play this whole business of the examples with the errors, that's a paradox. And I was talking to Joe about this. Schoenberg felt that the paradox made you think. And then I looked up philosophers on it, and when you have paradox, you have to think, because otherwise it makes no sense. But anyway, so that if everybody plays through the examples, and there's many, there's the, as far as preliminary exercises, well, there's two others. There's a version in Berlin of some of the stuff, and then there's a 1936 one with Gerald Strang, and they are different. And then you get, when you do this, finally into who do you trust? Do you trust Leonard? Do you trust Strang? Then there's the translation from Berlin. And that's really where, if you had to trace back, that's probably the first prose book he wrote. The rest were outlines before that, maybe you can trust that the most in certain ways. But I think here the music speaks more than the words sometimes. And so I don't know if that answers your question. I don't think that there's a definitive answer, but we are at an advantage, all of us who do the music, by pairing that against what's said.
Yeah, one more comment.
I guess everything is about approximation in one way or another. When you do translation, you try to preserve something, but you always lose something, and it's always about compromise. But I really appreciate that you question, what is, or ask a question, what is original? And I'm a native German speaker, and so it's like sometimes translating myself, right, from my native language into my second language. Sometimes it's actually goes backwards from English to German, and sometimes you don't need to do translation. It depends also how tired you are or how alert. So it's everything is very dynamic, but you always try to approximate, get as close to something that's accessible in the end too. Yeah, we want to have readers not stumble and have questions. There's also the goal of clarity in the process.
Okay, follow-up comment?
Thank you. I totally agree with you. I'm reflecting, though, now on Severine's response to me. What I like is that you brought it back to the music itself. And it occurs to me, I come from the literary side of things, and I studied with Gayatri Spivak at Columbia, who always used to say that practice norms theory. And this is what I believe you were saying, because it's the music has to be then normed or theorized or read in language. So the language, this is why I say I think I sort of wonder about originality. Language is already another realm to which all of these permutations, translations, and rereadings occur. But it's the practice, as you point out. The language is already a reading of the practice in a way. Am I right? That's sort of what I gathered from what you were saying.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
And I think it's the way it is. And I don't know. I didn't know if I answered your question about original, but I think the origin is those examples, and he did them first, and he was driving at that. He even got paradox in. He put all the errors in the that you have to think about the sound in that way. So there's levels of hearing before you hit the texts. So, okay.
All right, thank you.
Okay, I'm staying here not because I want to go, but you explain what's happening. Let Phil do that.
Our third presenter, unfortunately, is not able to Zoom in for us today. And so he asked if Severine would read his presentation. So she's going to read his presentation, and then we won't take any questions, and then we'll end our morning session. All right?
I just want to say that Avior Byron is in Israel now, and the situation is, you can see, not conducive to necessarily zooming in. Okay. And I will read as best I can, and he's also not an English speaker, so expect, shall we say, non-idiomatic things. Okay. Avior Byron is part of our Oxford series, and he's writing on Schoenberg and performance. So hence the title, Was Schoenberg a Chauvinist Toward Performers? It relates to the book. And this is section 1 I'm going to read first, obviously, and it's called the Newland Quote. Chauvinism refers to an unreasonable belief in the superiority or dominance of one's own group. Chauvinism can manifest in various contexts, including political, social, and cultural spheres, and is generally reviewed negatively due to its association with intolerance and prejudice. This paper examines whether Schoenberg believed that composers are superior to performers in a chauvinist manner. Let's begin by analyzing in detail which is arguably the most provocative quotation of Schoenberg on performers. Many writers, among them distinguished musicologists, for example, Botstein, Cook, Dannhauser, and Taruskin, portray Schoenberg's attitude to performers in a very negative light. These authors base their argument on the foregoing quotation by Dika Newland, found in the 10 January 1940 entry from her diary. Quote, "Music need not be performed any more than books need to be read aloud, for its logic is perfectly represented on the printed page, and the performer, for all his intolerable arrogance, is totally unnecessary, except as his interpretations make the music understandable to an audience unfortunate enough not to be able to read it in print." Unquote. Newland further claims that after Schoenberg said these words, he warned her, quote, "Do not tell anyone I said this, for there are those who would stone me for it," unquote. No other individual ever verified any of this content. What these authors, and he means, Taruskin et al., do to define, do not tell their readers is that the circumstances under which the quotation was supposedly uttered is not really clear. Newland was only 16 years old when she wrote this. She reports that Schoenberg was in a composition class and was just recovering from an illness. She writes, quote, "He was quite well yet. He looks pale and worn." This is from the diary. "His illness, conjoined with his previous overexertions, has left him exhausted, both physically and mentally." Newland claimed that he warned her not to repeat what he said. The Newland quotation is not written in her diary as a quote at all, but in her own words, while the only parts of the reported quote are framed with quotation marks. Newland continued to contemplate in her own words that, quote, "He's surely right when he says the class of composers is higher than the class of performers, which is exactly what I've thought ever since I was old enough to hold any opinions about such things. Her diary," and that's unquote, "her diary is full of," this is now Avior, "full of childish jokes on the expense of her class friends and teachers, including Schoenberg. In one diary entry, she openly admitted that she did not admire Schoenberg's character, and she, quote, always thought of him as mean, unquote, although she recognized him as a great teacher and composer. There is a difference between a rumor, a sketch, and a published article. Some of the respective authors mentioned above even claimed that Schoenberg, and not Newland, actually said these very words. This is not true, and it seems unfair to me. The Newland quotation has widely spread and is often recycled uncritically in academic literature. Some of the authors that use the Newland quote give the readers to imagine what they wish. Others build an argument which is more sophisticated in the way it distorts Schoenberg's thoughts on performers and performance. An interesting example is Nicholas Cook's influential article, quote, "Between Process and Product, Music and as Performance," unquote, that opens with a pointed attack on Schoenberg using Newland's quotation. He accuses Schoenberg of marginalizing performance by prioritizing the score as the true essence of music and viewing the performer as merely a mechanical reproducer. In another source, Taruskin, in his seminal The Oxford History of Western Music in the late 20th century, uses Newland's quote to state that Schoenberg's attitude toward performers is, quote, incorrigibly snobbish, unquote. Taruskin argues there that for Schoenberg, not only performers are redundant, but also listeners. What is particularly concerning is that all authors simply ignore other important and well-verified evidence that contradicts Newland's statement. I will present some of it now. This will include writings, correspondence, and testimonies by performers. Now going to section 2, refuting evidence. Schoenberg acknowledged that performers could bring new insights to his compositions, even revealing aspects that he himself had not fully realized. This is evident in his letter to Alma Mahler, dated January 19, 1929, where he expresses admiration for Paul von Klenau's performance in Gurrelieder. Schoenberg wrote that Klenau's interpretation, quote, showed me many performance possibilities for this work in a new light, unquote. This statement demonstrates Schoenberg's openness to performers' interpretations and his willingness to learn from their perspectives. Schoenberg's respect for performance is fully evident in his flexibility regarding alterations to his compositions. In a letter to Pablo Casals dated March 16, 1933, Schoenberg showed remarkable openness to changes in his concerto for cello and orchestra. He wrote to Casals, quote, I do not know if I already mentioned that I regard the cello part to be a kind of draft if you say that there is something that does not sound good, or which is not written idiomatically. Of course, I will continue to change everything until we have come to an agreement, unquote. This demonstrates Schoenberg's respect for composers' expertise and practical knowledge of their instruments. He even went so far as to say he would add simplifications to the published version to make it accessible to younger cellists, students, and amateurs, showing his consideration for a wide range of performers. On the 26th of December, 1934, the cellist Emanuel Feuermann was interviewed by the Daily Mirror in the U.S. about his experience of working with Schoenberg. He commented, quote, "I was pleasantly surprised to find him the epitome of tolerance itself, allowing the artist all the freedom in the world. He amicably agreed to all suggestions I made in regard to the cello portion, which at the start was so tremendously difficult that it appalled me," unquote. In a panel discussion in 1992, Louis Krasner recounted an argument he had with Steuermann, this is the pianist, who had helped him prepare Schoenberg's violin concerto. Quote, "There was one place where Steuermann said, quote, 'You played the notes too long. I think it's not the character,' unquote. So I said, quote, 'I have to play it that way. Well, we'll go and we'll play it to Schoenberg,' unquote. I played it to Schoenberg, and he was very pleased, and Steuermann couldn't resist asking Schoenberg, 'Isn't it too long the way he plays these staccato passages?' unquote. Schoenberg said, quote, 'I didn't notice. Play it again,' unquote. I played it again, and he said, quote, 'I like it like that,' unquote. Steuermann said, quote, 'But there are dots there,' unquote. Schoenberg looked at me and said, 'Shall I erase the dots?' After the performance, Schoenberg wrote to Krasner a letter with many questions concerning the performance. Schoenberg was interested in the performers' experiences of his music. He encouraged performers to trust their musical instincts. In a letter to Gunther Schuller in 1950, he wrote, quote, 'One must depend upon one's own musical feelings,' unquote. This advice shows Schoenberg's respect for performers' intuition and musical judgment. Schoenberg was aware that the interpretation of the score is influenced by performance traditions. Understanding performance cannot be understood by analyzing a score alone, but must take into account such oral traditions of performance. In his essay, Brahms the Progressive, in Style and Idea, Schoenberg discussed the importance of systematizing performance irregularities, showing his respect for performance traditions and the nuances that performers bring to music. In several manuscripts, he argued that performers should not merely play the notes of the score, but must interpret them. In a commentary around 1940 titled, quote, "Expression, True to Notation? Performance must be based on interpretation, exclamation point," unquote. Schoenberg wrote, quote, "A performance which is only true to the notation is by no means necessarily true to the content, for the notation is only a very imperfect picture of the idea," unquote. This clearly indicates that Schoenberg believed performers needed to go beyond simply playing the written notes and should interpret the music and convey its true content. In a letter to Charles Munch from 1950 discussing, quote, "the first condition for a good performance," unquote, Schoenberg stated, quote, "The first condition for a good performance is that each player should know what others have to play. He should know the whole score as well as his own part," unquote. This suggests that Schoenberg expected performers to understand the full context of the piece, what he saw as the organic musical idea, not just their individual parts, implying the need for interpretation beyond simply playing the notated music. These examples demonstrate Schoenberg's belief that composers should engage in interpretation rather than a simplistic reproduction of the score. He valued insights and understanding that performers can bring to the realization of a musical work. In 1950, the Juilliard Quartet performed all of Schoenberg's string quartets for the composer. Robert Mann, the first violinist, explained that their interpretation was, quote-unquote, wilder than Schoenberg's expected. After playing the first quartet, Mann testified that Schoenberg said, quote, "It was a way of interpreting that he had not imagined." We were stunned. Schoenberg burst out laughing and added, quote, "But play it that way, it's good," unquote. Richard Hoffman was present during this session, and he recalled that after the Juilliard Quartet performed before the composer, they had questions regarding tempo. Schoenberg, who was moved to tears by their performance, answered that since they were so technically perfect, they can take almost any tempo, and it will be always clear and distinct, unquote. As shown above, Schoenberg, for Schoenberg, the essence of a composition was the presentation of a musical idea. In the manuscript Performance and Gestalt from 1934, he first wrote, quote, "Perhaps this already indicates that performance is partly the task of presenting musical ideas." But then he crossed out the word zum and wrote above it the words auch ein, in English also. This alteration turns the sentence into the following. Perhaps this already indicates that performance is also part of the task of presenting musical ideas. To be fair, one must state that Schoenberg adds immediately after, quote, "Only insofar as performance is not included in the composition does the right exist for the interpreter to contribute," unquote. We might read this as a slip of the pen, or spontaneous thought in progress, where Schoenberg admitted for a moment that performance has a part in the presentation of the musical idea, thus elevating the role of the performer towards the composer, and immediately corrected himself to give the composer more importance. What is clear, however, is that Schoenberg, the performer, is not redundant, as the Newland quote suggests. I'm going into section 4 now, and Avior has obviously made an argument, very clearly about the quote, but now he wants to share his contradicting evidence, okay? Despite Schoenberg's statements, acknowledging the role of the performer can be contradictory in several ways. Schoenberg did believe in the superiority of the role of the composer versus that of the performer in particularly conversations with very well-known musicians. And maybe, there's more behind what he says in these quotes, or what he says in his quotes. Shortly after 1917, Schoenberg reacted to a liberal view of Busoni on the relationship between composer and performer, and he writes, quote, "The more interpretation respects the written symbols, or rather the more it attempts to realize the true meaning of the author, the more it must be rated. For the interpreter is not the instructor, let alone the spiritual mentor of a bereaved work of art, but its keenest servant," unquote. This statement establishes a clear hierarchy, with the composer at the top and the performer in the subservient role. Schoenberg uses the term servant is particularly telling, suggesting that performers should not see themselves as co-creators or equal partners in the musical performance, but rather as faithful executors of the composer's will. In other writings, Schoenberg was confirmed that performers would that by performers misinterpreting musical ideas, they would add, for example, excessive rubato or dynamic fluctuations that were not indicated in the score. He argued that such additions often obscured the music's inherent rhythmic and structural qualities, which he considered essential to the composition's integrity. He saw such acts as intended to glorify the performers on stage at the expense of composers and their musical ideas. Consider the expert opinion for the Academy I don't know, I guess it's Schoenberg's comment, yeah. Quote, expert opinion for the Academy at the Prussian Academy of the Arts in Berlin. And this little expert expression for the Academy was written on the 4th of December, 1929, where Schoenberg wrote, quote, it is not sound that is essential, however much the composer endeavors to compose for sound, but rather it is written. The, parentheses, geometric, mathematical, or architectonic, close parentheses, relations between pitches and time frames. If the composer contemplates sound dynamics and tempo, then by doing so, he is already the interpreter of his own ideas, i.e., he employs the means of presentation to lend his own ideas to the possibility of a general understanding. Here, Schoenberg is writing from the position of a composition teacher trying to demonstrate his expertise. Yet one sentence later, he philosophizes as following, quote, to a certain extent, the performers are thus the interpreters of the interpretation, unquote. Although this is an interesting thought, Schoenberg immediately retreats to the more conservative view and states, quote, but the musical idea is complete without any interpretation as soon as it is written down. This is the last sentence that arguably resembles the Newland quotation. This is the last section now, section 5, and it says, it's called In Conclusion. It is crucial to understand Schoenberg's writings in context. To whom he wrote, what did he react to, what did he try to defend or attack, how mature were his ideas in each case, is there contradictory evidence? Fully contextualizing the writings mentioned in this paper and other relevant writings is beyond the scope of this lecture. However, it is important to note that because Schoenberg's writings on performance are often fragmented and the context is not always clear, hence it is easy to misinterpret them. Schoenberg was undoubtedly a significant figure in music, both as composer and theorist. However, like many creative individuals, he had a complex personality that sometimes manifested in provocative statements, particularly when he felt threatened or unwell. It is important to approach Schoenberg's more controversial utterances with nuance and context, rather than taking them at face value. Some scholars have drawn far-reaching conclusions from Schoenberg's statement. For instance, Torsten suggested that Schoenberg viewed both performers and listeners as unnecessary. Other academics, such as Clara Moritz and Julie Brown, have explored potential anti-Semitic tendencies in his writing. Philip Ewell even proposed that Schoenberg's theories implied a belief in white superiority. Isolated statements should not be taken as representative of Schoenberg's entire philosophy of work. A balanced approach allows to appreciate Schoenberg's complex contributions while recognizing the risks of overinterpreting provocative remarks. Scholarly arguments based on partial information can create misleading perspectives that are particularly difficult to refute due to the element of truth. One could argue that Cook and Taruskin were not attempting to judge Schoenberg's comprehensive views on performance. They were simply trying to use the Newland quote as a springboard for their own ideas. However, this is not the case. They suggest that Schoenberg was snobbish toward performers on a regular basis and that his attitude led many others to follow. However, none of Schoenberg's writings on performance that I've discovered appear to be formulated in such a blunt and offensive manner as the Newland quote. None suggest that Schoenberg believed that the performer is inherently inferior to the composer. None claim that the performer is redundant. Many of Schoenberg's other writings and correspondence reveal a deep respect for performers and a recognition of their crucial contribution to musical experiences, his willingness to collaborate with performers, openness to their interpretations and alterations, recognition of their role in presenting the musical idea, and appreciation for individual artists all point to a deep respect for the art of performance. Schoenberg valued the human element in performance, encouraged performers to trust their musical instincts, and recognized the essential role of performance in making music comprehensible to audiences. Schoenberg even speculated that as composers, performers too have a part in presenting in reality the metaphysical musical idea. These findings challenge the simplistic notion that Schoenberg was a chauvinist toward performers, instead showing a more nuanced and complex appreciation. It is time that the widely cited Newland quotation will be replaced with a deeper and more comprehensive understanding of Schoenberg's ideas on performance. We can clap and for Avior.
Thank you, Severine, for reading Avior's paper. I just want to congratulate all three presenters for this morning's session, Gordon Root, Severine Neff, and Avior Byron. So give them some love, please. Yeah.